Charlotte Readers Podcast Beyond 300 is about you, the listener. We want your feedback, opinions, recommendations, and questions. Email us or leave us a voice message and you might hear us mention you or play your message on the podcast. Just go to the homepage or contact page at charlottereaderspodcast.com and look for the links to email us or leave a voice message. It's easy to do. Let's have some fun together.
All right, we're going to dive into the topic now for today. How to draw inspiration from setting and how to imbue. That's a nice word. How to imbue. Can you say that real fast? How to imbue your writing.
I had to Google
with
what
a strong.
that meant. I was like,
It's a nice literary word. Imbue it.
Sarah is our literary word. Sarah writes these little pieces here, so maybe we should have Sarah read. Okay, Sarah, you read the topic of the question
Let me
here.
pull it up here. How to draw inspiration from setting and how to imbue your writing with a strong sense of place.
It goes very
See, it
well
just
with your
sounds better
voice too. It's like
Exactly. So we're going to talk about setting. And I thought before we started, maybe we'd talk about books that jump to mind for us individually that maybe the settings stand out. And I'll give a few first, and then y'all can jump in as well because I'm surprising you a little bit with this. But I think of one of my favorite books, Lonesome Dove, because it's a cattle drive that starts in South Texas and ends up in Montana, and it crosses the Great American West. And so setting is very much a part of the character from the Mexican border all the way to the lush and green pastures of Montana. You just sort of, it becomes part of the story. And while I'm on Westerns, any Louis L'Amour book is going to put you, on a cattle drive or a desolate, water-starved place, or a windswept plain somewhere. From when he's writing, you find out about not only the land, but setting also involves the clothes, the weapons, the towns, the trails, the people. What's this place like? Is it a wide open space? Is it a tight space? And I think of the classic, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because the river is very much a character, in the book, and setting is very important. And even To Kill a Mockingbird, the small town and the courtroom scenes, where the whites are on the first floor and and black people are relegated to the gallery above, and then there's injustice throughout. You can sort of feel the tension in the setting itself. So those are a couple of mine. I don't know if any jump to y'all in terms of books you've read or liked that maybe where the setting actually has as important a part of the story as the plot and the characters do.
I feel like The Overstory by Richard Powers is the one that kind of comes to my brain. I don't know if you guys have read that, but it's a really incredible book. It's a long one, but overall it's kind of about how, our environment is so important and we don't take care of it. And they tell it's the story overall. It's about, there's multiple different parts, characters. We kind of learn all these different stories about different people who are tied to that cause, who decide okay, well, I love, the trees are a character basically. Why don't we take care of our trees? They literally filter our air. They provide for us, and we just don't take care of them. And the whole book kind of centers around that and the environment around us, and just different parts of the United States that you live in where people just aren't really taking care of their surroundings. So that's one that kind of jumps out to me. And I would say too, just going back to the recommendation for Kristen Hannah, The Four Winds, all of her books are super, super focused on the set. The setting has a huge part in each book. She has The Great Alone, which is out in Alaska, and that's totally a crazy location. The weather is a character basically. It's super different. So those are kind of the ones that stand out to me. And I love being sucked into a location, or just kind of being able to smell the food. That's something I love with books. If you're describing the smell of bacon in the kitchen, I'm this is my story. I love this.
I think you gave me feedback when you were reading one of the earlier drafts.
Yeah,
of my
I
book.
did.
You said, tell me more about what they're eating for lunch.
I know. I love that. It's the best. You want to get hungry while you're reading it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, maybe I need to come up with a menu for the indie retirement
You
community.
should. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a great promotional idea.
What about you, Sarah? What comes to your mind?
Well, if you want a book that is good both at describing setting and food, Where the Crawdads Sing is great for that. Obviously, for us being in North Carolina, it's nice to have a book that's set in North Carolina and that describes the setting really beautifully and kind of the nature in the sort of coastal North Carolina habitat. And she also gives really great descriptions of what they're eating. And I remember when I was reading the book, I was living in England and they eat all this like, down home North Carolina food. And I was so homesick. I was like, oh, I want like that type of biscuit, not the cookie type of biscuit.
The English tea biscuit.
So that one is good for setting. Yeah. I love books that have fantastical settings too. Sometimes those are the ones that are most memorable to me, like, the Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter, like where it creates this world that is not real, but it feels so real because it's described in a way that feels very detailed and you could just kind of imagine yourself there when you're reading it. Yeah, so I love those sorts of fantastical settings. Also, I think setting is place, but it's also time. So sometimes if a book can transport you to another time, like The Great Gatsby, really encapsulates a certain time and place really strongly, so much so that I think when we think about our image of that time period, so much of it is based on The Great Gatsby these days. So yeah, those are books that really kind of transport me when I read them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Historical fiction, has a way of taking you back and letting you experience, what was happening then. I want to play a little clip here from a very early Patreon episode we had with George Hovis. George Hovis wrote The Skin Artist, set in Charlotte. It deals with underbelly. He's been on the podcast several times, a friend of the podcast. But we did a little Patreon episode on setting, and I thought he had some really interesting points to share, and he's got a little quick reading here. So I'm going to play that, and then we'll come back and talk about the craft of setting.
One of the jobs of a fiction writer is to embody the story in a place. You don't want these disembodied voices talking to each other. The reader wants to inhabit a world. So, that pencil sharpener's on the wall. You've got two characters talking and you need them to do something. Well, one of those characters can go over and sharpen a pencil,
right,
and threaten the other one with it.
There you go. We got a novel starting already.
Right.
Well, and you're going to have a short reading as an illustration here, but you used in The Skin Artist Charlotte during a period of time, and we talked about this a little bit on the show that's going to come out in season 6 about how I was thrown off initially because you referred to the big bank in town as Nations Bank, and I knew, well, gosh, it's not Nations Bank, that's Bank of America.
Yeah.
And yet I read further and I saw the Double Door, and I saw other sites that are now gone, disappeared, bulldozed.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, it's a different time period.
Yeah, it's back in the 90s, the boom era, or what for me is that first real explosive period of growth in Charlotte.
So tell us what you're about to read and how it illustrates the point you were just making.
So this is in the point of view of the book's protagonist, Bill Becker, whose life is coming totally unwound. His wife has kicked him out. He's about to lose his corporate job, or I think he has lost it by this point. He falls in love with this heavily tattooed woman. He starts to acquire tattoos himself. And this passage comes from a low point in the book where he's trying to get his bearings, and he drives to uptown Charlotte and walks to that intersection of Trade and Tryon and looks up at that massive structure, which, as you pointed out in the 90s, was the Nations Bank Tower. After a short drive to the parking garage and a 2-block stroll, he found himself at the base of the tower. In contrast to the airiness of nearby glass and steel skyscrapers, the Nations Bank building looked solid, built of stone and not just veneer. 60 stories, he stood and counted. He stood on the sidewalk and read the bronze plaque giving the building's vital stats. Every day of the year, the building consumed nearly 300,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. The people rushed by him on the sidewalk, oblivious to the monolith rising above them. For a better view, he backed through pedestrian traffic to the edge of the sidewalk, his back against the roar, standing within the flowing river of exhaust. 60 stories up there, the red, white, and blue flapped in the breeze. He leaned against the stinking breeze of speeding, honking cars and looked up, willing himself to forget his problems.
So George, I've been in uptown Charlotte practicing law for many years, and I've looked up at, not only as they built it, but as I walk by it every day, and I can just see it just towers into the sky.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And you talk about using in this case, you use sort of the tattoo as sort of a talisman as you go through it, but you also have this monolith.
That's right.
This sort of phallic symbol.
Yeah, that's right.
It's in the story as well. Do you like placing these objects in stories to kind of be symbolic or metaphorical of what the story's about?
Yeah, absolutely.
And talk about the value of doing that.
Well, a setting becomes a character. You know, every reader has read a review that says of a book setting, it was more than just a setting, it was another character in the novel. And I think that's what we have to do to bring a setting to life in a story. Ancient peoples were animists. They believed that spirits lived in trees and streams and the soil. In a sense, as a writer, we've got to practice literary animism. We've got to penetrate beneath the surface of a place to divine its spirit, its essential character.
And your book does that, because I was, as interested in what was happening, in the setting as I was, with the characters. And the characters were kind of symbiotically attached to this setting, because actually it's sort of like this underbelly. You've seen that Netflix Upside Down World or Underworld, whatever that thing is, where it flips and there's an underside to it. Well, you might be a part of this upper world like Bill Becker is in here, but he gets pulled below the surface.
That's right. He starts out in a gated community, in a corporate career, and then he gets sucked down into this seedy underbelly, gothic, underworld of Charlotte, of
and
strip joint, tattoo parlor.
And if he'd just been pulled down from the second floor of the bank to the first floor, it wouldn't have been quite as interesting.
Right.
All right, I couldn't remember at the time we recorded that, but I think the show is Stranger Things.
Yes.
I knew which one you were talking about, though.
Yeah, maybe this is the Stranger Things meets Uptown Charlotte or something.
Exactly.
That sounds good.
That was about what that book was about. It was sort of, you had this corporate world and then you had this underworld of tattoo parlors and hanging out at the Double Door Inn and that kind of thing. So very interesting. But so as we start into this topic here, and we're using George's thoughts and recommendations as a starting point, we really got two parts of this. How do you draw inspiration from setting? Then how do you, to use Sarah's word, imbue? You're right. Really strong, such to say. So one is about drawing inspiration. The other is actually putting that into your work. So let's talk about the inspiration part of it for a second as a writer. How important is it to y'all when you're writing a piece? It could be an essay, Hannah, that you've written. It could be a screenplay or novel for you, Sarah, or a short story. Do you think about the setting before you start writing?
For me, it's always different. Sometimes I start with an idea for a character. It might be a story. It might be a setting. It really just depends from project to project. I do have a short story I've been working on recently where the setting is kind of what came to me first. And it's this imaginary, it's kind of like a dark fairy tale that's set in this town that's not quite anywhere in real time or space. So that was fun to write. But yeah, it's very different for me from project to project. Sometimes the setting is something that I come up with first. Sometimes it's more of like a almost tactical decision later. And this is something that Kathy Daniels also talked about when I was speaking with her, was part of how she came up with the setting for Live Caught was looking at a map and figuring out like where these rivers can join. And that gave her ideas for how she could situate her character Lenny because of this journey that he has to go on. So sometimes it's about thinking in terms of the story you're trying to tell or the experiences you need your character to go through. And you kind of pick a setting that allows for that. And sometimes it's more just, I want to write a story that's set in this place that is important to me for whatever reason. So it can be a lot of different factors, I think.
I like the fairy. I want to read that. That sounds really kind of interesting without any kind of time, or I love that.
Yeah.
I think for me, since I do a lot of essay writing and nonfiction, it's kind of always, there's always a place that it's like that's the thing that I remember the most about a lot of things. It's kind of like I was saying earlier about reading books where there's heavy descriptions of food, or like like being outside in a field, stuff like that. That kind of hits me in my heart a little bit. Like, I feel like I'm a very sensory person. Like I like, smell, stuff like that. So I feel like when I'm writing about experiences that I've had, or if I'm writing, even if it's something to do with like a professional recap or something like that, it's always kind of like, this is where this happened, and this is kind of a huge part of my experience. I did dabble in some like short story writing, and I was very into creative writing in college, especially. And I quickly realized it wasn't. I think my attention span's a little too short to, carry that out, which is probably evident. But when I was doing that sort of thing, I feel like I was, I wasn't thinking that way. Like I was more so, it's like, this is a character that I really want to explore. Like I really want to get to know this person and how their brain works and things like that. And the place almost didn't even come to me until like halfway through writing something. So I guess, you're right. It sort of depends just based off of probably what kind of writer you are and what story you're trying to tell.
I didn't realize until I asked this question of you and of myself how much I've been inspired by settings and what I've written. One of the short stories I wrote that won an award was set on the Cape Fear River. It was a trip we took when I was 8 or 9 years old, and it's essentially, it is the heart of the story, this trip that went bad, where we tried to make it from Fayetteville to Wilmington with my dad, and nothing good happened along the way. But also, my latest book, Deadly Declarations, where the retirement community became a focus of the story, and that inspired me to write about themes that relate to that setting. In other words, connecting the setting to the themes of the story. What's it like to live in a place like this? What's it like to be forced to go there against your will? All these kinds of things. So I have been inspired by settings, and I've got, before we dive into the whole how to imbue your writing. I like that word again. We'll go there again. I've got a little clip from the audiobook of Deadly Declarations that it's just a light touch on what happens early in the book about the setting itself. I'll play that now.
Yeager stood on the crushed gravel path that fronted his cottage and bordered Lost Cove Lake, the smaller of the two Indy lakes. He liked to get up early and walk the land, around the community center, past the 5-story residence buildings, between the cottages that fronted Freedom Lake, and across the property line to admire the Hezekiah Alexander Rock House, the jewel of the Queen City History Museum. The house was built in 1774 and had stone siding with strange carvings, if you knew where to look, and Yeager did. It had been home to one of the signers of Mecklenburg County's controversial and long-vanished Declaration of Independence from Britain, signed on May 20th, 1775. Yeager's best friend, Matthew Collins, was taking him on a road trip in a few hours that had something to do with the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. The 96-year-old Collins was known to everyone as the Professor because of his love of history. The Professor did not believe the Meck-Dec had ever existed, but he'd promised Yeager a surprise on their outing, one he, said Yeager, would like. What Yeager didn't like was the ambulance being parked in front of the Professor's building. He walked the 50 yards up the hill and stopped in the shadows, not 20 feet away from a woman dressed in a medic uniform who was talking on a radio. The early morning air was cool and smelled of pine and rain. Clouds gathered. The quiet before the coming storm allowed the seriousness in her voice to carry on the freshening breeze. He's dead, collecting the body now. Yeager followed the paramedic into the building and onto the elevator for a ride to the 3rd floor. He let her step out first, held the door until she was out of sight, and slid into the elevator lobby. He peeked around the corner of the narrow hallway and saw her enter room 312, the residence of his best friend.
The reason I played that is because I was trying to, early in the book, kind of give a sense of what this community was like without, diving too deep into the structure. So you find out there's a lake called Freedom Lake. There's a Lost Cove Lake. And these tie into the themes of the book too. Freedom, lost, because the main character's lost at this time. Freedom is about, what they're trying to discover with the mech deck. And you find out about the cottages and the condos, which sets up the cottage owners against the condo owners. And you find about the Hezekiah Alexander house, and you get a little peek into, what it's like, these condos, third floor and that kind of thing. So, not by any means, a perfect example of, setting, but I think it helps to introduce a little bit about the setting early in the book. I don't know, y'all's thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, actually, this is something that I wanted to ask you about when I was reading Deadly Decorations, was the retirement community is fictional, right? Like, you made that place up. There's no indie retirement community.
So it's funny you ask, because there is a retirement community right next door to the Hezekiah Alexander house.
I was wondering, yeah.
It's called Aldersgate. And when I spoke out there, they asked me if it was patterned after Aldersgate. And I said, well, if you like the book, absolutely.
Whatever you want it to be.
But it's kind of like a collage or a mishmash of lots of different retirement communities that are becoming available now for people 60 and over, and it is just, but there are a lot of similarities in all those communities. There, in terms of structurally and maybe what the grounds look like, differences, but in terms of an activities director and all these activities, those are the kind of things that are part of the setting that people will recognize if they're familiar with it.
Yeah,
So.
I think part of what you did that made the setting in that book feel very real is that you tied it to real places like the Hezekiah Alexander home site and these other sites within downtown Charlotte and stuff like that. So it all kind of feels woven together so that you totally believe that this could be a real place.
Yeah,
there.
that's so
Exactly.
true.
Yeah, and we just, it's right next to the Hezekiah Alexander house is part of the Charlotte Museum of History. I just happen to call it the Queen City History Museum in my book. But, there are a lot of places I changed the name just slightly in the book because they had big legal departments, and I didn't want to mess with them.
Yeah, you probably had some people reading this book, and they're thinking, like, if they're looking at going to a retirement community, they're like, does this exist? Because that's like where I'm trying to go.
I want to go. I want to hang out.
Murder.
Yeah, that sounds exciking.
Hang out with Jaeger.
Yeah, exactly.
Hang out with Jaeger. Shoot fish in a pond.
Sounds pretty fun to me. I don't know. Never a dull day.
Exactly. All right, well, the second part of the question is how to do it, how to imbue your writing with a strong sense of place. And, I'm going to rely upon, well, of course, Sarah, you've done this, and Hannah, you've done this in your writing too, but I'm going to rely upon this craft book that Donald Moss wrote about the breakout novel for a couple of points, but I'm going to defer to y'all first. Who wants to jump in? How do you do it? What's the trick?
I think one thing that I think is really helpful with making a setting feel real and like you're there is to kind of pick both good and bad parts of it. Like a book that I believe I actually recommended this on our last episode for my recommended read is called Honestly We Meant Well by Grant Ginder. And it's mostly about this American family, but they're traveling in Greece, which is a great setting. It's one of those places that it's kind of aspirational as a setting. Everyone wants to go there. It's beautiful. The food is great. It's a big tourist attraction. And he picks up on a lot of that in the book. And there are descriptions of the beautiful cliffs and the oceans and wonderful meals that they eat and the little winding streets in the towns and all that sort of thing. But then there are also descriptions where it's like, oh, it's really hot, or the beach is crawling with tourists, or we've eaten feta every meal and we're really sick of it, that sort of thing. So I think it makes it feel like you're really there and it's a real vacation. And yes, there are moments that are beautiful, but it's also the reality of any place. It's not perfect, it's not ideal. So I think that picking out those little details that might be both positive and negative can make a setting feel really realistic and kind of transport you there more, at least for me when I'm reading.
I feel like, yeah, that's definitely true. I think, especially when it comes to books about travel, or if you're going somewhere that, it's like Eat, Pray, Love. I feel like that's one of the books that I think about, which is so focused on place and just being somewhere different. That's definitely true. There's great things and not so great things and some scary things that happen and stuff like that. I think for me too, when I'm reading a book, if I'm, I think when people bring setting into the story really well, it evokes emotion for me. And that's having as a reader, That's one of my favorite things ever. You kind of want that like floaty feeling in your chest a little bit when you're reading about something happening somewhere. I feel like when I do write, especially essay writing, if I'm writing about something that's happened in my life, especially I used to write a lot about childhood and just memories and that kind of thing. It's like you think about, like me and my sister used to make these fairy houses, and that was very focused on where we would do that. And it made me like feel something. So I always feel like when I can feel something in my chest, or if it's like making my feelings into a character in the experience of reading. I don't know if that even makes any sense, but it's just that's kind of how I feel when it's done correctly, like if it evokes emotion, because if we're looking at a book where the place really is kind of a character in its own story, I think that's sort of the goal with all of your characters, right, is to kind of you identify pieces of yourself in that. So I think for me that's probably one thing for sure.
Yeah, and so this book I was referring to, Donald Moss writing the breakout novel, is recommended by the thriller writing team Brian Andrews and Jeff Wilson. They appeared in episode 292. He says some interesting things about setting, which I really didn't think about when I was writing. I hope I did it to some extent, but he says there's a psychology to place. And Hannah, this gets to the point you talked about emotions. It might be the kind of place that cheers you up, or it's the kind of place that he says, quote, gives you the creeps, right? It's definitely got its own psychology. But he says that a good setting is not just one that has an impact on the reader, but it has an impact on the characters. And it makes the characters feel something, and by doing so, it makes the readers feel something. And he suggests that you should give your characters an active relationship with the setting. And I guess, using my book example, the characters have an active relationship. Some of them like being in the retirement community. Some don't like being in the retirement community. Mm-hmm. And that's a relationship, whether it's, good or bad. And he says when telling the story through a point of view character, he suggests trying to, evoke the description of the place by how the place makes the character feel. If you're in that character's head and you're in this space, what is the character feeling when they're there? This is not just, as he said, don't fall into textbook mode. Don't just describe, every little flower and petal and pebble on the path along the way. But he says, if you're in a character's head, what does this place sound like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? To Hannah's point about food. What does it feel like? Do they rub their hands along something and they get a certain feeling about the texture of the place? Is it a very remote landscape to where it's hard to breathe? There's sand, or is it an uptown city where the horns are blaring so loudly they can't even hear themselves think? If you think about that, that helps give the reader a sense of what the place is like if the character is experiencing something about the place. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are great points from both of you. And I think a lot of it comes down to giving specificity to your setting, where you're not just, it's great to describe a setting in a way that feels very real and you're detailed and all of that, but you don't want to just write a travelogue. Like you want it to be through both your lens as an author and the lens of the characters who are there and how they're experiencing it, and how does the setting help to inform the character and vice versa. It's like there's a piece of advice that I've heard before to, write the story that only you can tell. And maybe you can think about it as write about a setting in a way that only you can write about it, or in a way that only this story and these characters would experience that setting. So I think that gives it a lot of specificity too.
Yeah, and I think one question maybe as we wrap up this discussion to think about is, how much is too much, right, when it comes to setting? It seems to be like a lot more description in literary fiction
for
than
sure,
there is
yeah.
In genre fiction. So, and maybe that's just a matter of taste, right?
I think it is, honestly, because there's some books, and I think I had said this like in an earlier episode when Sarah, you recommended the Murakami book. It's like before I'd read any of his stuff, I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is just going to go kind of over my head, because that can happen sometimes with me in very like like literary fiction to a T. I can kind of just be like, okay. Like the Goldfinch. I mean, haters come at me with that one, but like the Goldfinch, I was like, I can't do this. Like, this is like 700 something pages of just like straight up description right now for me, which, I mean, it works in some situations and in other times it doesn't. So I think it probably does depend on just kind of what your taste is. Like, what kind of books do you like writing? What do you like reading? And then I don't know. I think it's probably just up in the air, I guess, but not for me.
What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have the prose to pull it off, like you can write descriptions that are long and kind of make them work for their own sake if the writing is beautiful enough, but you are sort of isolating yourself into a more niche market when you do that, because there are readers who will read just for the language and that's enough, but probably the majority of readers, they want the story to be moving too, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And you can
I
do
can't
both
wait
at
for
once.
this plant to grow to another foot before we get to the point here. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, look, these are a lot of great tips, and I'm gonna, take this into account as I work on my next thing.
If you are an author who would like to be featured on the show, check out our submission process on the contact page of charlottereaderspodcast.com. Please understand that given the number of submissions we receive, we can't respond to every submission or feature everyone who submits, but with the Beyond 300 format, we are featuring more authors in many different ways. You might be interviewed or provide us some audio content for us to play, or participate in an author or marketing talk, or get a shout out for your publication. One way to be sure to get a mention on the show is to submit a 750 word or less blog post to our community blog on a writing or marketing topic. If it's accepted, we may have you on to discuss the content. Just go to charlottereaderspodcast.com and look for the community blog for details.